Well, I would say that it fits into his general motif of painting all elections that he loses as stolen or rigged. In 2016, when he beat Hillary Clinton but lost the popular vote, he claimed there were 3 to 5 million non-citizens voting. In 2020, of course, we had the COVID pandemic, and Trump railed against mail-in balloting, claimed that there was a lot of fraud. And of course, in the aftermath of the 2020 election, he tried to overturn the results of the election by pressuring election officials and elected officials to change vote totals. So he has a long history of trying to claim election fraud.
Well, welcome to another edition of SOS America. I'm your host, Charles Feldman. Thank you, as always, for being with us, whether you are watching or listening. We appreciate it. In the past year, for those of you who have been following this podcast, you know that we have covered a lot of different angles to the Trump administration and to try to answer the question, what is actually happening now in this country? And we've been trying to answer that question for people who live outside the country, but also for people who actually live in this country. And we've covered a lot of different topics. We've talked to physicians and lawyers, and we've talked about almost anything under the sun except what may be the most important thing for a functioning democracy. And that is what we will be talking about on this particular episode. What we're talking about, elections, because to have a truly free, functioning democracy, you have to have truly free and functioning elections. Every research has shown that this country has that, always has. But there's one person who thinks that that is not the case, who thinks that our elections are tainted, who thinks that if certain people win, that's fine, but if certain people lose, then it has to be rigged. That is what we will talk about on this episode of SOS America. And joining us for it is Professor Rick Hasen, who is a legal scholar, a law professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. He writes many op-eds and other articles for such publications as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, goes on and on and on. Written many books. I think he's actually in the middle of writing another one. So I thank you, Rick, for taking the time out to do this podcast. And most importantly, he is an expert, a renowned expert on the issue of elections. Rick, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you.
So let's start sort of, I guess, from the beginning. I said at the very opening, as you heard, and I think I'm right, that this country, the U.S., has had a pretty good history of open and fair elections, certainly in modern times. Is there anything about what I just said that is not true in your view?
Well, I think our elections have been consistently improving. I would point to the 1960s as the time when we stopped having uh, the potential for elections to be stolen. Readers may remember the Robert Caro book on Lyndon
No.
Johnson and how he helped to manipulate the outcome of the 1948 primary on the Democratic side for the U.S. Senate. Even in 1960, when we had the very
Kennedy
close
Nixon, right?
right. So in that race, there's some credible evidence that Illinois might have, and specifically Chicago, might have been manipulated to favor Kennedy, as well as Texas. But I would say that for a variety of reasons, and this is actually the beginning part of the book I'm working on, America moved to better party competition, stronger media oversight, professionalization of election administration. And so by the 1980s, I think we can say that we've had pretty fair and free elections. We also had, of course, in the 1960s, the enfranchisement of black voters in the South, While there are occasional instances, usually in very small localized elections, where there might be election fraud, sometimes or typically committed by election officials rather than voters, our elections have never been fairer than they are now or better administered.
Okay, so as you know, fairly recently, President Trump made a national address. The main topic, elections, and what, in his view, he says they're not fair, that, he still is harping on the 2020 election, saying that it was stolen from him by the Democrats, by Joe Biden, without, of course, offering any evidence, because there isn't any. And more importantly, I think, laying the groundwork for the upcoming midterm elections in November. What do you, first of all, in a sort of overarching look, what did you overall make of that particular address and what he had to say? And then we can drill down a bit.
Well, I would say that it fits into his general motif of painting all elections that he loses as stolen or rigged. This goes back at least to the Iowa caucuses in 2016 when he was running against Ted Cruz, lost in the Iowa caucuses and claimed there was fraud. In 2016, when he beat Hillary Clinton but lost the popular vote, he claimed there were 3 to 5 million non-citizens voting in American elections, all for Hillary Clinton, he said. Um, there were investigations, and there were maybe 30 cases nationally of non-citizens voting. Um, in 2020, of course, we had the COVID pandemic, and Trump railed against mail-in balloting, claimed that there was a lot of fraud. And of course, in the aftermath of the 2020 election, he tried to overturn the results of the election by pressuring election officials and elected officials to change vote totals, legislatures to send in alternative slates of electors, the vice president to change the right. This is Vice President Mike Pence to change the rules for how Congress certifies the results of the U.S. elections. And of course, there was the violence on January 6th, where his supporters, after a speech Trump gave, stormed the U.S. Capitol and tried to interfere with Congress's counting of those electoral college votes and certifying of Joe Biden as the winner over Donald Trump. So he has a long history of trying to claim election fraud. Since he's become president again, he's tried to make voting and voter registration harder. He's pushed for legislation to do that, the Save America Act. But he's also tried to take executive actions, including trying to order the post office to do certain things, the Department of Homeland Security, the United States Election Assistance Commission. And so the speech that he gave in mid-July was one where he was recycling old claims of interference in elections. He actually didn't claim that the 2020 election was stolen. I think this was his attempt to be more of a statesman, as much as he can be, with statements still that were unsupported. He claimed that documentation that would be declassified and released would support his claims that China interfered with the election, that multiple non-citizens are voting in elections. And really, the evidence that was released didn't support any of that. So the question going ahead is he going to try to interfere with the 2026 midterm elections, or is this just more of an old man ranting about an election he lost, kind of sour grapes about 2020?
Well, by the way, I mean, even if he didn't explicitly mention in the speech in July about the 2020 election being stolen, the fact that he was claiming without proof that China somehow manipulated votes, it presumably would have been in favor of Joe Biden, not in favor of him since he lost. So one can still infer from what he had to say that he's still griping about 2020.
Oh, yeah, he's certainly griping about 2020, but I just thought that the empirical claims that he made were more subdued. And notably, John Solomon, a former journalist who's now working for Trump on this issue, was interviewed right after and asked, do you have any evidence that any votes were changed by China or there was any fraud in the 2020 election? He said, not yet, no. So, I mean, that is notable that there were not the explicit claims of a stolen election. I mean, Trump has made that claim literally um, thousands of times. So,
Yeah.
uh, you know, um, really, if it's retrospective, who cares? I think the country has moved on from the 2020 election, besides Trump and his most ardent supporters. But if this is prospectively about trying to interfere with the 2026 midterm elections, that's where I think there's room for concern.
And that brings me to this, that whatever his motivations might be, and we can come to some, I guess, logical conclusions what they might be, for making these claims, the claims wouldn't resound anywhere if it weren't for the fact that tens of millions of Americans apparently believe that. They do believe that elections are unfair. They do believe that elections are rigged for certain people, for certain parties, and rigged against other parties. Um, is that simply because Trump has been such a good, and I use the word good in quotes, such a good salesperson, convincing these millions of Americans that he is right? Or is there something else going on here?
Well, I think you can't understand how Trump has been able to convince millions of his supporters that the election was stolen without looking at the massive technological and information revolution that's been going on. So I don't have to tell you that local journalism is in trouble. It's in
Mm.
trouble because the economic model that supported local newspapers and local radio stations was one of advertising. And as that advertising moved to the internet and then to social media, there was no longer the same kind of money available for investigative reporting and for the kind of objective news coverage that we've seen, where the news media could serve as one of those mediating institutions that can help voters discern the truth and figure out whether what politicians are saying is truthful or not. At the same time that local media was taking a serious hit, social media was making it much easier to spread false information. This is what I've called the rise of cheap speech. It's cheap in the sense that it's inexpensive, but it's also cheap in the sense that it's less valuable. So today, almost anyone with a little bit of sophistication can set up a website that would look, just as good as the LA Times website, for example,
Mm.
and yet it could be full of lies. It's very easy to create the illusion of truth. So Trump, as a kind of social media entrepreneur, was able to speak directly to his supporters without mediating institutions. And part of his message was to attack those mediating institutions. So he attacked the press as the true enemy of the people, spreading fake news. He attacked the FBI. He attacked the courts. Right? These are the kinds of institutions. He attacked the universities. These are the kinds of institutions that help voters figure out what's true and what's not. And so it's possible to create a kind of, if not a closed media ecosystem, at least one that puts Donald Trump's claims right before voters in the palm of their hands on their phones daily, making these claims. So it's not surprising in this unmediated atmosphere that a demagogue like Trump is able to get his supporters to believe things. And by attacking the media as biased, he kind of inoculates himself when the media accurately reports what's going on as somehow that this is indication of bias.
But that this sort of new landscape, the social media landscape, is not going to change anytime soon. If anything, it may get worse. So, is everything dependent upon just basically the goodwill of whoever happens to be in the Oval Office? And so this time the issue is Donald Trump. Next time maybe it would be a Democrat who has equally odd views about the electoral process. What is going to solve this?
Well, so I think that is kind of the big question of what is American democracy going to look like once Donald Trump leaves the scene. On the question of elections specifically, I'm hopeful that after the midterm elections, when Donald Trump, I expect, will not be trying to run for a third term, he's going to take less interest in the system. I mean, why does he care about the midterm elections? It's because if Congress becomes democratically controlled, rather than under Republican control, there are going to be subpoenas, there are going to be investigations, there might be impeachments of his cabinet members, investigations. I mean, it's going to make the last 2 years of Trump's life very difficult. Right now, he's got Mike Johnson essentially in the House. He's the Speaker of the House as a rubber stamp of Trump. And so he certainly cares about what happens in 2026, but maybe he doesn't care so much about what happens in 2029, when the new president comes in. He's going to take the billions in self-dealing that he's been able to make while president, another unprecedented thing. He's going to take the billions he's made and go off and still be a kingmaker for the Republican Party, I think, for as long as he's able to function. He commands a great presence. So what does the Republican Party look like after Trump is gone from the scene? What does the Democratic Party look like? We don't quite know because the coalitions of the parties are changing. Many more working class voters, first white voters, but then also some Latino voters and Asian American voters moved over towards the Trump populism, and many wealthier white college educated voters who had been part of the Republican coalition moved over to the Democratic Party. We don't know if we're in the moment of realignment or not. I certainly hope that we're not going to see another demagogue picked as the Republican nominee. I mean, some people said it could have been Charlie Kirk if he had not been the victim of a political assassination. We
So
don't know what that's going to look like, but you're right that there's this danger of demagoguery coming from the left and the right. And my hope is that there are enough sensible people in the center who'll be able to move on from the kind of election denialism that has been a feature of the last decade towards something that looks more like normal politics.
but if the Republicans lose the White House in the next presidential election, how do you convince, to go back to those tens of millions of Americans who Trump has convinced, that elections are fraudulent if your party loses? What do you do with all those millions of people who I suspect will flock to social media claiming that the Democrat, if a Democrat wins, is there because of fraud?
Well, I don't know that, again, if Trump is gone, if they're going to do that. But remember, that's what happened after 2020. We did make it through 2020. I think kind of narrowly made it through. We're lucky that we didn't have the vice president and members of Congress assassinated, which could have happened with the invasion of the Capitol. Um, Grousing, uh, you know, blowing off steam, that's okay. If it leads to political violence, then we're in a lot more trouble. So, uh, there's a core part of the Republican Party that is going to believe if a Democrat wins that it's because the election was stolen. But I don't think that represents the vast majority of the Republican Party or the vast majority of the American public. So we can maybe write off 20 or 30% of the American public as not believing this no matter what. Um, but that still leaves most American voters on the left and on the center who would accept the results as legitimate. And if
I,
that doesn't happen, we're in a lot more trouble than we're in right now.
Yeah, I actually kind of wonder as you were speaking, I was thinking, this, as you know, really a split developing in the Democratic Party between the sort of center, I guess, center left and the extreme left, right? And I wonder if a centrist Democrat wins the White House, if the extreme left is going to also jump up and down and say this was fraud, it was stolen from us.
Well, so I think that the kind of claims that are made of stolen elections are different on the left and the right. So, from the right, from Donald Trump, what you hear is that Democrats, minority voters in big cities, immigrants, are manipulating the vote. It builds into a kind of implicit racism about how elections are run. Now, once Trump starts making claims about rigged or stolen elections, that activates not only the Republican Party base, but it gets Republican legislators to make changes to voting rules to make it harder to register and vote. And even though the SAVE Act has not passed in Congress, a number of Republican states have made it very hard for people to register to vote. In some states, like Arizona, you've got to provide documentary proof of citizenship, like a passport or a birth certificate or a naturalization certificate. And if you've changed your name, your marriage license, in order to be able to register and vote. This is sending the message that Republicans are trying to manipulate the election rules to their favor. So I think it's far more likely that if there are claims on the left that the election was stolen, it would be a claim of voter suppression rather than a kind of claim of fraud that we've seen from the Republican side. It would just be kind of a supersizing of the things we've heard on the left for many years, just like Trump has supersized the voter fraud claims that predated Donald Trump by many decades.
Can you explain to viewers and listeners outside of the US who, if they're following what's been going on here with Trump and elections, and they may be thinking, well, what is wrong with the President of the United States wanting to make sure that elections in all 50 states are conducted in a way that the electorate can be confident that the results are accurate. And I could see somebody living in another country thinking, what's wrong with that? Sounds logical to me. Can you explain that one?
Sure. I was recently on German TV and I was asked, well, what's wrong with requiring proof of citizenship? So I think we have to kind of back up a little bit and talk about how the unique election system in the United States is run. So our Constitution is very old. It does not have a national nonpartisan body that administers elections, which is what you see in most other advanced democracies, whether it's Canada or Australia or Germany or the UK. I mean, these are all places where bureaucrats who have some insulation from politics are the ones who run elections. So we have instead, because of our old constitution, a hyper decentralized system. The states get to set most of the rules for elections, subject to congressional override in some cases. Um, but states give the power to do the kind of nuts and bolts of elections to counties. So when we hold an election, um, for president. We don't hold a single election. We don't even hold 51 elections representing the 50 states and Washington, D.C. We instead hold something like 10,000 simultaneous elections on the county level. These counties might have different early voting periods. They might use different voting machines. They might have different rules for how they verify absentee ballots. So we have this patchwork of election administration in the United States. Now, back in 2012, I wrote a book called The Voting Wars and said, we should update things, we should modernize things, we should nationalize our system, have a national nonpartisan system of election administration. I've now backed off of that because I think American democracy is too weak to handle a nationalized election system because in the hands of a demagogue, that system might be manipulated. So the Constitution does not give the president any powers over how elections are conducted. And while he could use his bully pulpit to say changes should be made, the president himself can't make changes, even though he's tried through various executive orders. The key parts of those have been put on hold or struck down by the courts. So what we're
Yeah,
talking about here, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
well, no. I was going to say, you said in passing a line that really struck me, which is that American democracy is too weak. And you were talking about to have a national election system, but divorcing that from the first part of the sentence, American democracy is too weak. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we, I believe that if we had a national election system, that Donald Trump would have taken it over, even if it was nominally independent, and he would have been helped in this by the United States Supreme Court, which as recently as June ruled that all branches of the executive government have to be under the ultimate control of the president, the so-called unitary executive theory. This is the theory that allowed Trump to fire the head of the Federal Trade Commission. Now, they carved out an exception for the um, Federal Reserve. I would like to think they would carve out an exception for the running of elections, but who knows? But so what we see is that now states have to serve as the bulwark against federal interference in elections. I mean, the idea that we have to protect American elections from the federal government, as opposed to relying on the federal government to help protect the integrity of elections, shows you how weak our democracy has become. One of the things I'm working on as director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA is trying to educate judges about how dangerous it would be to allow the seizure of ballots by the federal government in the event that we have a close election. Um, when you seize ballots, you break the chain of custody and you don't know who's actually won an election because ballots could be altered or added or subtracted. And yet we saw at least a couple of instances of the Trump administration seizing voting machines and seizing ballots from old elections. I hope it's not a test run for 2026. So this is what I mean by the weakness of American the weakness of American democracy. Our system of election administration, because the Constitution doesn't give strong protection for the right to vote, and because we diffuse power over who runs elections, we're in there are just many opportunities for bad actors to try to manipulate election rules or interfere with election tabulation of ballots.
So here's where it gets somewhat interesting. So the president in the United States agrees with you. He thinks that American democracy is weak. And that's why he says we have to save America. And that's why we have the Save America Act. Why don't we want to save America?
Well, first of all, if we actually wanted to improve election administration and we wanted to protect American elections, we wouldn't take the actions Donald Trump has taken. So Donald Trump fired all the commissioners on the United States Election Assistance Commission, which helps to certify voting machine standards to say which machines are least susceptible to manipulation. He wouldn't have fired over a third of the people who work for our cybersecurity agency that helped in the past to provide assistance to state and local officials trying to stop foreign malicious actors from trying to break into voter registration databases and do other things. So if you look at his actions rather than his words, I believe he's being disingenuous when he says he wants to protect elections. The other point is that the Save America Act doesn't address the things that he's talking about. It doesn't address voting machines. It doesn't address Chinese interference. What it does do in its key part is nationalize this idea that we're going to require documentary proof of citizenship for people in order to be able to register to vote, including people who've been registered to vote, some of those people for many decades. There was a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican of Alaska, talking about how some of her constituents would have to travel 600 miles at their own expense, cost them maybe $1,000 if they want to show up in an election office with their papers to try to register to vote. These kinds of laws, unlike voter ID laws, where the disenfranchising effects are uncertain and debated, there's no question that documentary proof of citizenship laws for registering to vote are incredibly suppressive of the vote. And we know that they prevent virtually no non-citizen voting because non-citizen voting has been investigated and looked for years, and the number of cases are quite small. And that's not surprising. If you're a non-citizen and you register to vote, you have to sign under penalty of perjury that you're a citizen. If you do that and you lie, not only could you face deportation, you could also face jail time. It's a felony to do that. And for what purpose? You'd have to have a huge conspiracy if you're actually trying to swing elections by registering thousands of non-citizens to vote. It's just not happening. And it couldn't happen without it being detected by election officials. So I don't take Donald Trump at his word. I look at what he's doing, and what he's doing is making our elections less secure and undermining voter confidence in the integrity of the election process.
I'm curious, with students that you have, and I presume they come from different places and different walks of life. Do you have students who agree with what Donald Trump is trying to do, and what do you tell them?
Well, we don't spend that much time in my election law class dealing specifically with Trump. There are lots of issues about elections from the
Wait a
voter
minute, but
that
isn't
exemplify
wait, hold it,
that.
wait, are you actually saying that Trump is not central to every discussion that is being had? Is that what you're saying?
So I do think, hold on, my light just went off because I haven't moved. Let me,
No, it's because we mentioned Trump. When that happens, lights
yeah,
go on and off. It flickers. We have that here too. But go ahead.
yeah,
You don't
yeah.
cover it that much in your classes, but
So, I do think that generally speaking, Trump is an unpopular figure. He polls at around 30%, and I would say among law students, he would probably poll a little lower than that. But uh, I hope our election system, election law, and democracy um, is it raises questions far beyond Donald Trump. And while there is certainly great interest and concern about the upcoming elections, I think we have to think about broader questions of voting rights more generally in this country. This past April, the Supreme Court decided a case called Louisiana versus Calais, which essentially killed off a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. This is now going to make Congress a lot whiter, a lot less diverse, because you're going to have some states, especially in the South, that are going to get rid of districts where minority voters had a chance to elect their candidates of choice. So we've got a lot of other problems with democracy besides Donald Trump. And I think really, uh, if Donald Trump resigned tomorrow and we, went back to some kind of normalcy in terms of claims of election fraud, we still would have a lot of problems with American democracy and how we run our elections.
would you agree that the election system, the electoral system in this country, while basically fair, is not perfect, right? There's room for improvement. I would suspect you would argue.
So if we're talking about whether election administration could be more efficient, whether we could get rid of poor performance, I certainly agree with that. I think that there are pockets of problems, and unfortunately, in close elections, that's where all the attention goes to the problematic areas. I mean, if we just take California, where I live, um, we take a really long time to count ballots. You think of
Yeah.
Los Angeles County alone is larger than many states. And lots of voters vote in the last week or the last days before the election. And they vote using a mail ballot, which they either put in the US mail or put in a ballot drop box. It takes time to process those ballots. That's actually a very dangerous period in the current era that we're in because Donald Trump uses that delay and the shift in how vote totals seem to go from Republican candidates to Democratic candidates is something nefarious. It's actually
Mhm.
not. It's the fact that Democrats are more likely to use mail ballots and they're more likely to vote later. And so the vote totals shift. But I certainly would prefer if California and other states that are slow could speed up the processing of their ballots so that we could get results faster. Not because we need to know immediately for any intrinsic reason, but because in a moment of distrust, like we're in right now, we need to do everything we can to help promote transparency and efficiency in our election system.
All right. So, for the moment, I'm going to elect you president of the United States. So, you're president, and you're looking out at how elections are held in this country. Do we need a President Hasen's version of the Save America Act? And what would it be?
Well, if you look over my shoulder, you can see a book called A Real Right to Vote.
Mhm.
That's a book that makes an argument that we need to amend the Constitution to uh, put the right to vote in the Constitution. You might say it's already in the Constitution. Well, it's not. The Constitution doesn't guarantee anyone the right to vote for president, a fact that the Supreme Court affirmed in the Bush versus Gore case after the disputed 2000 election. And so I propose an amendment that would actually uh, give voters the right to vote in all the elections that are held in the area where they live. It would also create a national system of universal voter registration and voter identification. It would, create what most other countries have is a national identity card, which makes it very easy for you to know who the citizens are and whether or not they're eligible to vote. The United States doesn't have that. But it would create a system. It could be state-based, but the federal government could come in if the states don't want it, and it would make sure that all eligible voters, but only eligible voters, are able to register to vote. It would also protect minority voting rights. I mean, I think there's a lot that should be changed. It's not the president's job to make those changes. I think it's Congress's job. Every time that voting rights have been expanded in this country, it's been by Congress. Congress is the one that passed the 15th Amendment barring race discrimination in voting, the 19th Amendment barring sex discrimination in voting, the 23rd Amendment enfranchising Washington, D.C. for presidency, the 24th Amendment barring poll taxes, the 26th Amendment barring discrimination in voting for people who are at least 18 years old. So I think it's really up to Congress and then the states to protect voting. And I hope if we're in a post-Trump moment, as it's not clear what the party coalitions are going to be, that it would be in the interest of both Democrats and Republicans to more muscularly protect the right to vote in this country.
Okay, so let's say you get your constitutional amendment. Everyone has a constitutional right to vote. Everyone who's eligible has a constitutional right to vote. Aren't we kind of back to where Trump is? How do you define who's eligible? How do you prove who's eligible?
Right. So one of the things that has to be done is that the United States needs to take on, and the states need to take on all of the costs associated with determining people's citizenship. So right now, let's say you live in Arizona, and let's say you're poor and you want to register to vote, and you can't afford or don't know how to get a copy of your birth certificate. Well, you're now disenfranchised. Under what I propose, it would be the federal government's job to go out and figure all this out, speak to the voters, get those documents at no cost to the voters, and create inter operationally between states a kind of national list of who is eligible to vote. I don't have any problem with identifying who's an American citizen and who is eligible to vote. The problem is how it's being done. The idea that someone in a remote area of Alaska would have to spend over $1,000 of their own money to be able to travel in person to a voting place in order to show documents in person to an election official, that's not the way to do it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it means that the costs should be borne by the government, it is in most other countries that are democracies. Voter registration is automatic and it's conducted by the government, and that's what we need here too.
So, temporary President Hasen, here's what I might argue if I were a member of Congress in the opposition party. I would say there are no free lunches. That if you want the federal government to incur the costs of making sure that everyone who has a constitutional right to vote is eligible, they may not have to pay out of their own individual pocket for that expense, which I would suspect would be pretty large. But taxpayers would have to pay for it because that's where the money comes from. What would you say
Sure.
to that?
I'd say democracy is expensive. We already spend hundreds of millions of dollars running our elections. We spend billions of dollars in campaigns in terms of who is going to be elected. Democracy doesn't come cheap. What you're saying is you recognize that these costs are really burdensome, well, think about how that falls on poor voters today. I mean, that just shows you, we can't have a plutocracy where only the wealthy are able to register to vote. Look, if you say no big deal, just show your passport. Well, most Americans don't have passports. They cost $180 to get. They're good for 10 years. So what about all those people? Are they going to be left behind? I think if we wanted to be serious about protecting the right to vote and assuring that all eligible voters, but only eligible voters can vote, it's going to cost money. But it's better for that cost to be borne by the government. And I think it would be a fraction of what we've already spent in Iran, in the war over the last 5 months, than what it would cost to do this nationally for the entire country.
Let me double back to what we briefly touched on earlier, which is China. The president's, without proof, suggesting that China had something to do with changing the votes in the last election, the one that he lost, which, of course, there's no evidence for. But no one, I think, disputes, the intelligence community doesn't dispute, that China, Russia, are all interested in trying to figure out how they can impact the elections in this country, whether it's by swaying public opinion, which would be a kind of more benign way of doing it, or actually physically figuring out how to change votes, which would be a very malignant way of doing it. How concerned are you that some foreign power will be able to eventually succeed in doing exactly what Trump is now implying they're doing?
Well, let's talk about China first and what
Yeah.
Trump said. So Trump said that China basically stole 220 million voter um, uh, information on 220 million voters from voter registration databases. In fact, the material that he declassified didn't show that. It showed that China tried to buy the voter registration databases that are publicly available in some places. So what is that? I mean, that's kind of I don't know. I wouldn't call it benign, but that's not having publicly available information is not quite a threat. Um, Also, China engaged in some information shaping activities, like trying to use social media to influence how people vote. But the intelligence showed that Russia, which barely got a mention by Trump, has been much more active in the information space and trying to use disinformation to rile people up, maybe to vote for Trump or vote against Hillary Clinton, as they tried to do in 2016. I mean, that is a concern. That's a concern in terms of how voters get reliable information, as we talked about earlier. But that's not the same as like hacking voting machines. And I think on that that question about hacking voting machines, I think what your listeners have to know is that we have safeguards in place to make sure that the voting machine totals are checked by hand. We have something called a risk limiting audit, which more and more states are doing. It's a statistical method for hand counting a subset of ballots to make sure that the machine count is accurate. And so I don't think we should trust the machines. I think the machines actually do help us because we know that machines actually can count ballots faster and more accurately than people. When they're reading a Scantron form, like how you take the SAT. Um, but there are ways that we can check to make sure that they're accurate. Think about in the 2020 election, the vote machine said that Donald Trump had lost the election in Georgia by 11,780 votes. Trump claimed fraud. And so the Secretary of State there, Brad Raffensperger, ordered a complete hand recount of every ballot in the state. And, with some very minor discrepancies, the results came in the same. And so the concern about foreign interference with elections, we have to design our election systems to make them foreign proof. And it would be really nice if the federal government fully funded again the cybersecurity agency that helps to prevent this kind of stuff and had commissioners on the Election Assistance Commission that could help states figure out which are the reliable voting machines to use in order to count ballots. So there's a lot that we can do. I have some concerns, but what Trump said just did not match what the actual evidence was, which is not surprising because that's been a longstanding pattern for him to make claims that are either false or unsupported by any evidence.
When Trump won the first time against Hillary Clinton, I remember talking to a lot of different experts, academics, politicos, you name it. And they were all very depressed. Not all, but many of them were. Certainly those who felt that Trump was a bad pick to be in the White House. They were depressed, but they said, and I remember this very clearly, that they were still optimistic that there would be a reset. They had that kind of confidence in American democracy that there would eventually be a reset. And by eventually, they meant the next election. And in fact, of course, Joe Biden did win the next election. And some of those same people I doubled back on, and they sort of said, ah, you see, we were right. We had 4 bad years, but now we're back on the proper road until it went off the road. And now those very same people are depressed again. So what I'm getting at here, Rick, is are you optimistic for the next, say, 10, 15, 20 years? I don't want to go much farther than that. I think that's too risky. Maybe even 10 or 15 years is too risky. But are you optimistic? And if you are, why?
Well, I think we're going through a very difficult period now, and I don't know what the future is going to hold. As I said earlier, the composition of the parties is changing, and the uh, information environment is changing rapidly. We didn't touch on the growth of generative artificial intelligence, which is certainly
Mhm.
going to be used to try to influence voters and do all kinds of things that might affect our politics. So the future, I think, is especially unknown. But, the message I try to give to people is not one of optimism or pessimism, but one of resilience. You got to put your head down and figure out how do we plod through to make sure that we can continue to have the rule of law respected and free and fair elections. And, the one bright spot here is the people who actually run elections, the local election administrators who've been beleaguered. I mean, they've faced threats, they've faced all kinds of harassment, but they do their job. They're transparent about it, and they help provide information to show that the way our elections are conducted in the United States is free and fair. And the more we can get the message of what's actually happening on the ground out to voters, I think the better chance we have of weathering this moment. So we've got those state and local election administrators. We've got the courts that so far have done a pretty good job in preventing the attempt to steal elections, preventing election subversion. And ultimately, we've got the American people. I think that when you look at polls, both the left and right, there are concerns about the future of democracy. I think people are invested. They may have different views as to what we need to do to protect our democracy, but they're invested in the idea that American democracy should continue. So I think we have to look for ways to move forward uh, and find common ground on things that could actually help to bolster both the system and voter confidence in the system.
When you talk about the courts, I suspect you mean really the lower courts. Are you confident the Supreme Court would really be a safeguard against some of the abuses that many people fear might happen in the years to come?
Well, so far, the courts, including the Supreme Court, have had a pretty good record in terms of election subversion. I mean, attempts to steal the election. So back in 2020, Ken Paxton, who was then and is now the Attorney General of Texas, filed a very unusual brief trying to get the votes thrown out from 5 other states. And the Supreme Court kind of gave that the back of its hand. It just denied it. It didn't even write anything. That was a good sign that it was not taking this seriously. We had a disputed election in 2024 over the um, North Carolina State Supreme Court race, where the Democrat beat the Republican by just under 800 votes. And the Republican contested the election, and he actually argued for um, uh, kind of retroactively changing the rules for who is eligible to vote to throw out ballots where people voted under the rules as they were announced. I mean, that goes against a very kind of basic idea of democracy that you hold the election under the rules as they were announced. And it took a federal court judge, one of the most conservative federal court judges in North Carolina, a member of the Federalist Society, to say this is not what our um, elections are about. It's about free and fair elections. Similarly, Judge Stephanos Bibas, who's on the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, a Trump appointee, when Rudy Giuliani went and tried to get the votes of Pennsylvania thrown out in 2020, said, free and fair elections are the lifeblood of democracy. You need to come forward with very strong evidence to show that election results should be overturned, and you haven't done it. And so I think there is this commitment among jurists across the political spectrum, and I talk to judges. They have a belief in continued free and fair elections. And so I am hopeful that even as they debate the Voting Rights Act and campaign finance on free and fair elections, I think we still have some good legal and social consensus.
Since you mentioned artificial intelligence, let's end with that. What do you see the dangers of AI in terms of elections anyway?
Well, so one worry is that AI is going to be used to trick people into believing that a politician has said or done something that they haven't done. Um, I'm a little less concerned about that risk now because I think people are aware how easy it's becoming to manipulate video and audio, but it creates a different problem. I think it means that voters disbelieve everything. And so it's really hard for people to know what's the truth. And so it's going to be kind of a cat and mouse game between those who try to manipulate public opinion with artificial intelligence and those who try to um, help voters. And I think there are many reasons to think that artificial intelligence in some ways could help voters figure out what their interests are, who they should vote for, and make sure that the information they're getting is accurate. We just don't know where this is going to end up, but I think people are sufficiently wary enough of the new technology that it's not necessarily going to make things worse. And like you said, it's hard to look far in the future, know exactly what these things look like. But certainly, we're already seeing campaigns try and use artificial intelligence to target voters, to give them messages, and that will continue.
Professor Rick Hasen at the UCLA Law School, thank you so much for being with us on this edition of SOS America. For those of you who watch and or listen, as always, we do welcome your comments. And if you would like to subscribe, it is absolutely free. Until the next episode of SOS America, I'm Charles Feldman. Thank you for being with us.